Morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our SEBS Virtual Science Cafe, Achieving Sustainability in a Divided Political Climate. My name is Brian McGonigal. I am the Manager of Alumni and Community Engagement at SEBS and for the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. Just a few notes before we get started. Our event is being recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube page subsequently, and we will also include it in a follow-up email to all registrants and attendees of this event. You can enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. And after Dr. Gottlieb's presentation, we will answer your questions in order as time allows. Right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mary Nucci. She is the Assistant Dean of Community Engagement and an assistant professor in the Department of Human Ecology. She is the director of the Science Cafe program here at SEBS. Mary, take it away.
Thank you, Brian, and good morning, everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Paul Gottlieb, who is a member of the Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics, where he teaches introductory economics and sustainability decision tools for SEBS undergraduates. He has worked as a regional planner for the New Jersey Office of State Planning, which later became the Office of Smart Growth. His doctorate is in public affairs from Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. At Case Western Reserve University, he became the director of the Center for Regional Economic Issues, a think tank charged with revitalizing Greater Cleveland. And in his research, which he will talk about today, he seeks to understand normative and positive aspects of the development of cities, suburbs, and countryside. So thank you, Dr. Gottlieb, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
Well, great. First, I got to thank Mary and Brian for sponsoring this program over the years. I think it's really important for community, and I think it has been and will continue to be a lot of fun. And I want to begin with that. You mentioned Case Western Reserve University. I got there from graduate school in 1993, and my job was to work on economic development issues at the scale of metropolitan areas. And I want to define what a metropolitan area is for those who don't know. Metropolitan area is formally defined as a central city plus the suburbs that surround it. The US Census Bureau defines a single metropolitan area actually as a cluster of counties, maybe 2 to 5. But at the center, at the core of it is a central city, and all those counties relate to the center city in some way. So think of a center city as a hole in a donut. The suburban ring is all the non-city folks that surround that hole. It's going to be important in a second. Because with that definition under our belts, you know what a metropolitan area is. I want to show you a bar chart that was published right around the same year that I arrived in Cleveland. And it was published in a report of the National League of Cities. And with that, I will share my screen. I want to show you this bar chart. Can everybody see that?
You can see it.
No, everybody can see that. All right. So this appeared in a 1992 report of the National League of Cities. And so it's a bar chart, but the sample, what this bar chart represents is data for a set of metropolitan areas in the United States, about 85 large metropolitan areas. So the bar chart wouldn't have been my preferred way of showing these data, but the important point is you got a set of metropolitan areas. For each metropolitan area in the sample, the vertical axis over on the left is a measure of metropolitan scale employment growth in the 1980s. The higher on that vertical axis, the more employment growth at the scale of the entire metropolitan area. The horizontal axis, as you move from left to right, denotes greater income equality between the central city of the metropolitan area and its suburban ring. So the horizontal axis is a measure of income equality internal to the metropolitan area, defined geographically, with greater equality as you move to the right. And the vertical axis, more metropolitan scale employment growth as you move up. if you wanted to think of this as a scatter plot where each point is an individual metropolitan area, Cleveland, New York, Chicago, I've drawn a dotted line to show you what the empirical relationship shows, which is that the greater the equality between the city and the suburban ring, income inequality, the greater the income equality between the city and suburban ring in a metropolitan area, the greater the employment growth. But I've got to tell you, when the authors described this simple empirical relationship, they might have gone a little overboard. They said, it was pretty much a direct quote, greater equality causes greater metropolitan area prosperity. And they then made a policy conclusion from that. They said affluent suburban residents should dig into their pockets and help pay for anti-poverty programs in the city nearest to them because it's in their own self-interest. They're going to get metropolitan employment growth out of that. Now take a look also at the title, and this is all the data that they use to draw that policy conclusion. And the title of the chart also, city suburban economic disparities adversely affect metropolitan prosperity. What they're saying is if you're too far to the left here, your metropolitan area with unequal incomes between city and suburb, you'll have less overall growth. So what I want to do now is just stop for a beat, ask everybody listening to this webinar, and I'm especially interested in the students out there, what statistical fallacy were these authors guilty of when they drew both a sort of scientific or empirical conclusion from these data, followed by a policy conclusion? Remember, the policy conclusion is greater equality causes metropolitan growth. It's in your self-interest to pay for city poverty programs. What's the statistical fallacy here?
So you can post comments in the chat if you'd like, please.
I can't call on students. I can't see the chat right now. So
we'll tell you if anybody says anything.
I was told to give you my preferred answer, and everybody arose as one body, and you all said association does not imply causation, or perhaps more particularly, association does not imply causation in a particular direction rather than another direction. I look at this graph, the first thing most people will probably say, oh, the greater growth probably caused improved equality. If that's true, then the policy argument that these authors made kind of goes out the window. They need greater equality to cause greater metropolitan level growth for their argument to hold. Now, I've been around the block many decades using US geographic data, and there's another enormous problem. You know why this graph looks the way it does? It's actually a graph of the greater employment of Sunbelt metropolitan areas as compared to northern metropolitan areas in the 1980s. And I know that's what's going on here because I also know that Sunbelt metropolitan areas generally have greater equality between cities and their surrounding suburbs because they've done a much better job of annexing those suburbs. The cities are bigger geographically in the South. They include much of what in Cleveland would be a suburb outside the city is included inside the jurisdictional city of Charlotte. So this result is kind of wrong in a dozen different and fundamental ways. But it was not the only study like this that appeared at this time. It was really it was almost like a cottage industry, scatter plots, same kind of argument. One of the authors of this study, he was getting some heat about his heroic conclusion from a mere association. He came to me, he said, Paul, I want you to write a literature review for the National League of Cities that covers everything we know about this and really sets us on a path to investigating it properly. And the best way for you to read that literature review on this subject of what are the causal relationships between city-suburban disparity and metropolitan and aggregate metropolitan economic welfare is that it was published as a chapter in this book by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy at some point in the 1990s. Anyway, to their credit, the National League of Cities said, hey, we've been too simplistic here. Let's do this the right way. And they commissioned me to do a report. I will also add, as I leave my screen share, did I leave my screen share? I think I left my screen share.
Yes, you're good, Paul.
Excellent. I will also add that wave of reports of this kind in the 1990s was associated with the Democrats winning the White House and a general atmosphere of creativity and new sensitivity to urban problems in the United States at all levels. In think tanks, National League of Cities is a think tank in a way. Lincoln Land Institute's a think tank. So there was a liberal moment in urban and regional policy. So what are the lessons? What are the lessons that I want to take out of this particular example? Well, first, I think it's, first of all, judging by the slapdash technique and the rush to publication of this report, these authors seem to have had a stake in proving that income equality and overall economic prosperity are complements, not substitutes. They wanted to eliminate the notion of difficult trade-offs associated with spending money to fight central city poverty. They argued, in effect, or they seem to have a stake in arguing, a predisposition to argue that this game is win-win, not zero sum. No trade-offs, right, in this case, for the richer suburbanites. The second main point is that the two objectives that were addressed in that bar chart and in this burst of studies in the 1990s, the ultimate policy objectives were reduced inequality, or social justice, if you prefer, and overall economic welfare, in their case, at the scale of a metropolitan area. Those, as we know, are two of the three broad policy goals of today's sustainability advocates. And the third goal, which may too often dominate the other two in current day discussions, the third policy goal, of course, is environmental conservation. So put social justice, overall economic welfare, and environmental conservation together, and you have the so-called three-legged stool of sustainability. Or if you're a corporate type, you would call it the triple bottom line. Know that there's three, and they are broad policy objectives that most people think are perfectly reasonable. And as we just shown, with their heroic interpretation of a simple bar chart, my authors, my friends actually, on metropolitan areas engaged in some wishful thinking about real-world relationship between two of the three sustainability objectives. Why did they do it? Well, sustainability theory says you should prioritize all three of those objectives equally: overall economic welfare, social justice or equality, and the environment. If you're prioritizing all three, wouldn't it be nice if they all moved in the same direction, no matter which lever you pushed? But before you think I'm about to accuse all liberals, and I do think this report is emblematic of a liberal view of the world. Before you you think I'm going to accuse all liberals of being ideologues who do bad science in support of a prior belief system, let me point out the advantages of starting with the concept of synergies or complementarity across goals as a premise, across the sustainability goals in particular. After all, the assumption that the three objectives of sustainability mutually reinforce rather than conflict with each other is actually driven by liberals' famous tendency to be idealists. Idealists have visions of things that society may never have experienced before or thought about. If synergy, complementarity across these broad sustainability objectives can exist, you first have to imagine that they do exist. And liberals are pretty good at that. And in fact, my literature review on the central city suburb issue, in my literature review, I outlined a half a dozen theoretical reasons why the synergy hypothesis of the two authors of the National League of Cities study might be correct. Nothing wrong with their theory. They just did a lousy job of proving those half a dozen theories with numbers. They were too, they moved a little bit too quickly. Okay. A reason why thinking about synergies is not necessarily bad. Another reason why it can be important to take the synergy idea as a starting point in research, policymaking, is that conservatives have the exact opposite bias in their assumptions about how the world works. And it's probably a bias that goes back further in intellectual history than the liberal idealism that I just mentioned. Conservatives like to think of themselves as hard-headed realists, don't they? They're always saying, well, that's all well and good, Mr. Liberal, but how are you going to pay for it? And when conservatives say that, they don't just mean dollars in the government budget. That is, if they're smart and educated. Some of them may mean it's just dollars in the government budget, but dollars in and of themselves don't mean a whole lot. When conservatives say that, what they should mean is the following: real resources are necessarily limited. So anytime the government chooses to do one thing, that necessarily implies that something else is left undone. There's a trade-off. And that observation explains why we economists actually deserve some blame for this age-old habit of always seeing trade-offs that you tend to get from the right side of the political spectrum. Because what I just stated is the economists' famous idea of opportunity cost. Now, the existence of opportunity costs in a world of fixed resources is real. And many people, certainly liberals among them, need to be reminded of it. But the economist's simple opportunity cost insight in connection with the use of a fixed block of resources, it doesn't mean that literally every decision that a person or a government makes will necessarily involve difficult trade-offs instead of synergies or complementarities. To think that it's a ironclad, hard, fast rule is just bad science. Let me give you a quick example how, if you just thought a little bit creatively, the policy community, the government, could immediately achieve greater equality and greater overall economic welfare. Think of this thought experiment. Go through the US tax code and the Code of Federal Regulations. Look carefully. Look for special interest carve-outs, special interest legislation that manifestly reduces overall economic efficiency and shovels benefits to the rich. Maybe it's a carve out for Wall Street, most obviously, shovel benefits to the rich. Economists know, because we're also political scientists part of the time, we know that those things are in there. Repeal that special interest legislation and boom, all at once, snap of the fingers, you've improved overall economic welfare and you've improved equality. Is that hard to do politically? Obviously. I only mention it. I mention it because you need the imagination to look for synergies. And that was one. That was one of them. And by the way, we're still talking about mostly about overall economic welfare and social justice. I will also admit economists have been famous over history for arguing that policies, I'm going to bump up now from metropolitan areas to the level of the nation state. Economists have been famous over history for arguing that policies to reduce inequality at the level of a country will always incur a penalty or a trade-off in overall economic welfare. The dead economist to Google on that thesis was named Arthur Okun, O-K-U-N. Google Arthur Okun. And while you're at it, Google the phrase leaky bucket, with which a phrase with which Arthur Okun will always be known. Okay, so that was the dominant idea about economic welfare and inequality among economists in the 60s, 70s, all the way through the 90s. But again, while we're talking about trade-offs or synergies between overall economic welfare and equality, I'm happy to report that a consensus is finally emerging among mainstream economists that extreme inequality of the kind we now have in the US imposes a significant drag on economic performance. So reducing inequality could become a win-win for enhancing overall economic welfare. Who do you Google for this new view? Well, the most obvious name is Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book about the dangers of inequality, very widely publicized, widely read book. But also Google the Harvard economist Danny Roderick, R-O-D-R-I-K. Because in the early 90s, he did a lot of empirical work confirming the old idea that it's always a trade-off. And in the last few years, he's changed his mind. He's seen better data. He's seen newer data. He now runs a group. He now runs a group with the title Economic Inclusivity in it. He knows social justice has to be part of improving the welfare of all. These are very highly regarded economists, and I'm proud that they've used, at least eventually, took them a while to get around to it, evidence-based reasoning to move from a prior assumption of trade-off to a recognition of synergies between social justice and overall economic performance. So in the time I have remaining, I probably may have spent too much time on the two sustainability goals that have nothing to do with the environment, right? This is the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. So let me continue my discussion, and I'll continue proving out my thesis here, my discussion of political propensities regarding the entire matter of, is it a world of trade-offs or a world of synergies? But let's add environmental conservation as one of the goals. And let's start by taking a well-deserved pot shot at the conservatives here. Consider the following statement, which is as old as the hills, right? A carbon tax will kill jobs. A carbon tax will kill jobs. All right. You hear statements like that from conservatives all the time. It's pure and simple trade-off language. Helping the environment is going to hurt the economy. I use it here as the preeminent example of a trade-off bias. Personally, a trade-off bias across two sustainability objectives, one of which is the environment. Personally, as a microeconomist, and all economists have to be microeconomists in terms of their root philosophy and toolkit, the statement that a carbon tax kills jobs is ridiculous. To me, right? After decades of having a price of zero on the atmosphere, how could properly pricing it be problematic, even if there's a transition, let's say, between fossil fuel jobs and renewable fuel jobs? I'll just say that in passing. I'm an economist. I find that trade-off argument, well, nothing short of appalling. But I'm not going to let today's liberals off the hook. Let me give you another example. And this example is worth digging into to think about what I'm saying today and just to think about how people think. And I want to give reference to the Green New Deal resolution of the Democratic Congress, feeling strong and proud whenever they won the legislature. Was it 2018? I can't remember. And they published the Green New Deal under the leadership of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey. What a wonderfully inspiring and idealistic document. It's really cool because it owns the sustainability, the three-legged stool. On every page, it's talking about the economy, the environment, and social justice all together. It's prioritizing all three goals. There's nothing more to say about it other than it's really inspiring as a way of thinking. Then we get to specifics. And there was something in this document that stopped me in my tracks. It starts talking about the need for federal R&D investments in new, clean, and renewable energy technologies and industries. Fine, well, absolutely an obvious thing that would be in there in the Green New Deal, with climate change being the background context for this whole discussion in the halls of Congress. Then the next statement read as follows. We want to allocate all these R&D funds, federal R&D funds, on clean energy, much bigger than presumably what we've ever done before, while prioritizing high quality job creation and economic, social, and environmental benefits in frontline and vulnerable communities and deindustrialized communities that may otherwise struggle with the transition away from greenhouse gas intensive industries. Frontline and vulnerable communities, deindustrialized communities, and communities transitioning away from fossil fuels will be prioritized for the R&D funding. Now, I spent 10 years in Cleveland. By no means do I think these aren't all fine communities with lots of resources to bring to the table, technology and otherwise. The real problem here, and it's a problem in government appropriations generally, is a dispersal of R&D infrastructure across multiple geographic areas. You know, I mean, the political system would do that anyway. But here, now, we're going to give some of this money to Detroit, some to Cleveland, some to Morgantown, West Virginia, some to the eastern side of West Virginia, some to Missouri, some to an oil region in Texas. Here is what academics know about regional economic development and have learned. Let me be more specific. What we know about economic development based on science and technology, on cutting edge innovation. It's got to be all in the same place. It works best all in the same place. Silicon Valley, the pharmaceutical cluster we're living in, although a few we're living in here in New Jersey, although a couple other cities have maybe taken the torch away from New Jersey. It's science all concentrated in the same place is the best way to get both technological and commercializable results. What we need here are the technologies. There's a huge conflict between this statement in the Green New Deal and what many other environmentalists have argued. We need a Manhattan Project for new green technologies. Think of the metaphor, the most concentrated in space and time collection of all the best people working to solve a very high priority human problem, the Manhattan Project, all in one place. If you want a Manhattan Project for new renewable fuels, I think you need to ditch this paragraph and say, well, we're going to have to find some other way to help. We're going to have to find some other way to help those frontline and vulnerable communities, deindustrialized communities. There is a trade-off here. And you had to know something. It helped to know something about current regional economic development theory to see it. I think some congressional staffers probably noticed it and they just passed it along because it looked like they could kill three birds with one stone. Okay, I've stuck it to the liberals now for not recognizing trade-offs. This is a trade-off that could be deadly. I mean, this trade-off could be very damaging in terms of urgent environmental priorities for the planet. A great way to end this whole issue, I realized, is to quote from my students. I teach a class in sustainability decision tools. It's really about life cycle analysis primarily. I co-teach it with Serpil Garan, an environmental engineer, head of the Eco Complex. Just, I know when there's stuff I don't know, so we do it together. And what I give my students in this class, I say, here are the three goals, high-level goals of sustainability theory. If you had to choose, pick one. And I know when I ask that in my discussion thread, I know I'm violating the cardinal rule of sustainability thinking. Whoa, don't make me pick one. They should all be of equal priority. I don't care, I say. Pick one to prioritize and justify your answer. The answers I get back are interesting and I think educational. So one set of students says, and this is probably the most common answer, well, if the environment collapses, then all is lost. And you can just forget about economic welfare or inequality for that matter. And I nod and I say, yeah, that's true, but it's kind of a truism. It's kind of a consensus. It's a little abstract to be a guide for action. What do we learn from that statement? You know, maybe not a whole lot that we don't already know and believe. Other students, however, when faced with this question, actively looked for synergies across the three sustainability objectives. One very interesting answer that I'm getting more frequently as time goes on is we need to prioritize social justice because we now know that democratic political systems will not be able to focus their attention on climate change until we get past our current polarization. Whether that polarization is driven by concerns over such things as systemic racism or blue-collar workers who've been left behind in a globalized economy, right? Different groups. Some of those are on the left, some on the right, but there's an economic motivation behind all of it. We need to work on the social justice problems, maybe even the cultural polarization as well, before we can turn our attention to, I'd say, I don't know if we have the time to do that. That's one answer. But my other thought when I get that answer is it's an extraordinarily astute statement about tactics. And it's an astute statement. And it's a statement that looks for synergies. Use A as a lever, use sustainability goal A as a lever to get B, climate change is, it's up to the back of all of my students' minds as the thing that we really, 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 really need to do. This is a tactical path to that objective. Some other students answer my question by saying this question, where I force them to pick one. They say, prioritize economic development. Well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Or overall economic welfare. And then they add, we need to prioritize economic development in the poorest countries because economic desperation and weak institutions in those countries contribute to harmful practices like clear-cutting rainforests and poaching wildlife. Again, they're thinking synergy and they're thinking tactically, not just the knee-jerk environment above everything. Yeah. Okay. Not only that, but if you think about it, this is a triple synergy. By defining increases in economic welfare at the level of the poorest countries only, which I think is reasonable, they've got economic development, they've got the environment as their ultimate objective, and they've explained why the environment will be helped, and increasing the incomes of the poorest countries in the world obviously achieves a social justice or equality objective at the scale of the whole world. The students are thoughtful and they give me ideas I hadn't even, they're thoughtful about synergies and they give me ideas that I hadn't come up with. We'll keep that discussion thread in the class, I hope. All right, I gotta close. Why is this? Why is it okay that I'm giving these remarks in a science cafe? Well, I think I've raised an important issue regarding the practice of science. I identified a potential bias. I described it as political, but if you think about it, it's almost emotional. It's a bias toward optimism on the one hand or pessimism on the other hand. And like any bias, it can affect both the questions that are posed in any research project and perhaps also the results. So I think that once we all become aware of this particular category of bias in connection with the triple bottom line of sustainability, we can avoid making costly mistakes in either direction. In my last set of examples involving the environment, I outlined statements by the right, both the right and the left, that I thought were just flat out wrong-headed and could take us in the wrong direction. One was an example of the trade-off bias. The other was the example of the synergy bias. Now, politicians will always approach issues with whatever emotional bias is in tune with their core constituency. That's just out there. As scientists and not politicians, we should be able to do better than that. And the simplest way is to realize, right, in connection with my remarks here, the matter of trade-off or synergy is an empirical one, not a prior belief system.
Thank you, Paul. You are Are you done?
Yeah. No, yeah, I am. I only want to mention very quickly, in case anybody's interested, I started with metropolitan areas. One of the whole reasons I decided to do this topic is that I have two other research projects at the scale of metropolitan areas that are ultimately about synergies or trade-offs. And one of them in particular, I took the synergy side of the argument. So if anybody wants to hear about that one. Okay, Brian, what kind of questions do we have from?
We got some questions from the audience for you. Referring back to the chart you showed at the beginning of your presentation, somebody asked if the Sun Belt metropolitan areas, is that Republican? Does that tend to be Republican, that area?
Yes, actually, but actually the more rapid growth of the Sun Belt compared to the Snow Belt precedes it. It started before Nixon fully incorporated the southern states into the Republican Party. Actually, regional scientists are not completely sure why economic growth has been so much more rapid in the South than the North. I mean, there's some obvious reasons. But few of those reasons, or none of those reasons, tend to be political. None of those reasons relate to party control, federal policy. There is no real federal regional policy outside of things like military bases and public infrastructure, Tennessee Valley Authority. I would like to know what's behind that question. My only point was that the graph made a causal conclusion on variables that happened to be correlated with what I thought was really going on, and the Sun Belt Snow Belt distinction in terms of income growth and employment growth, the level of metropolitan areas, it's off the charts. It's been true for many decades. And it just happens to be correlated with the variable that was on the horizontal axis of this graph. So it made the relationship spurious.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I'm a very left-leaning individual who is about to move to a rural red state as a new extension professor. Sustainability education as it relates to nutrition is a big part of my research program, which I want to continue. I fear I will be met with a lot of resistance from some colleagues, politicians, potential funders for my work. Any advice for reaching across the aisle and getting support for my work?
That's a great question. And can we be specific about the elephant in the room? Okay, we are in this institution perpetually trying to sell necessary, urgent sustainability, and the word itself it can be off-putting to some people, to a very traditional, older industry, agriculture. There are the farmers vote red no matter which state they're in. That's well known by political scientists. They are our stakeholders, our constituency. The word is off-putting, and I really love my own discipline's ability to do what you described. I'm completely comfortable using the word sustainability. But the nice thing about educating our undergraduates and giving them the economics toolkit is that they can talk to the business community in the same language, and they can talk to the business community in a language that they accept. We're okay with profit maximization. I want the carbon tax to be as high as you could, as high as it needs to be to get the job done. That absolutely needs to be done. After that, go ahead, maximize your profits, do your thing. I personally, I can use the word, and I use the word sustainability. I refer to these three goals. These three goals have been around for decades. They shouldn't be that controversial. So maybe we should talk offline about the context in which you're getting pushback. I'm not an expert on how that exactly how that would play out in the nutrition, right, in the nutrition food area. But I can imagine that it would. You could be getting pushback from supermarkets. I have no idea. Food manufacturers, all of them stakeholders of ours. I think that the gap can be bridged, and every day brings us a little closer.
Okay. And you're going to share your email address in our follow-up email with the audience, right?
Absolutely. Anybody can have my email address at any time.
Okay, great. All right, some more questions. With immigration into the U.S. from migrant coming across the border and things of that nature, how does that make it more difficult to eliminate inequality with more and more people coming to the U.S. and accessing those inequality programs?
Oh, you mean accessing welfare programs?
Yes.
Well, getting back to our core constituency, they want a particular kind of worker across the border into the United States. The farmers do. So there's having people to grow food is a plus. I think in the case of the United States, I believe that that issue is manageable. Now, a number of economists have actually tried to measure. I haven't seen any studies on the use of the welfare system. Obviously, a lot of people entering the country with not exactly the right documentation will try to stay as far away from those programs as possible. But I do know that a number of economists have looked at the effect of free immigration. We've never really had completely free immigration. They've looked at the effects of immigration on wages of the lower skilled, and they found a modest effect of the type that you're worried about, which is that immigration depresses the lowest skilled wages. I think their general conclusion, however, is that at the scale of immigration this country is ever likely to see, considering that our borders are more easily controlled than many other countries, this is a manageable problem. And there's something to be said in economics for replenishing your workforce in the age range 25 to 65 when you're an aging population like ours is. I mean, that's even aside from the skill levels these immigrants bring. That issue, very contentious issue in the United States. There's some evidence for a depression of wages in the lowest skilled occupations, but it's not ringing all tons of alarm bells to pull up the gate. And people are going to pull up the gate. The people are going to try to pull up the gate regardless of what the data says.
Okay. Somebody asked, is it too late to change the funding of the Green Deal to a Manhattan Project approach instead?
I would, you know what? I think probably not, but I would have to look and see how and if the Green New Deal has been implemented in the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better. They might. There's two possibilities there. Either they got the religion and they realized we need a Manhattan Project and they abandoned the idea completely. More likely, sad to say, more likely is that there's some money going to every constituency in Congress, all 300 and how many we got? 500, right? That the money is going to almost every district and certainly every state. That's the political norm. That is the argument that libertarians make with some justice. Government does things in a way that can be screwed up sometimes.
Other question? All right, were you done?
But I don't know at this point. The Green Deal was a very broad vision statement. Now we have these two new bills, and we really need to comb through them to see what the geographic implications are.
Okay. Another question. A lot of what you were talking about requires not just funding, but engagement with communities to participate. What if communities are more concerned about safety, food access, etc.? How do you bring these communities to the table?
They're more interested in safety. And what was the other thing?
Food access. Access to food.
Yes. And we want to bring communities, we want to engage with communities around, well, I will give you I'm going to give you a concrete example. A project, and this wasn't even one of the projects I was thinking about. Dr. Garan and I have done a cost-benefit analysis and also an environmental analysis of the idea of using anaerobic digesters in Bergen County to process a significant amount of their food waste. So the state legislature passed some bills basically forcing the feedstock into the system. And it's not clear in Bergen County that there are enough alternatives to landfill to properly dispose of the food waste that's going to be coming, that's mandated by the state legislature of New Jersey. So in May, I'm going to be on a panel, I think it's sponsored by New Jersey Future, along with my funder, the Northern New Jersey Community Foundation, and Dr. Garan, and we're going to talk about this study. One of the main issues, and we've invited a community organizer, and the Northern New Jersey Community Foundation has been thinking of anaerobic digesters as a kind of community development tool. They think of them as small-scale facilities that would be in multiple neighborhoods, that community organizations would be. They think of them almost as community gardens. I think that's good synergy thinking to start with. Oh, wow, here's this circular carbon solution that we've known about, and we're going to hit community development at the same time. Here's this list of progressive objectives. Great. I think there's a trade-off there. These things are they're NIMBYs. They are trash. They burn trash. And even if they weren't NIMBYs, people aren't going to want them in the neighborhood. So let's see what happens in May. We're going to actually talk about that. Oh, that is, and no, Godspeed to the Northern New Jersey Community Foundation, seeking to organize communities around projects that have this global, like this one, have a kind of global footprint. There's absolutely no reason why food security ought not to be on the table. It's social justice. It's a sustainability objective. That doesn't sound like an either or. Engaging members of communities is a perpetual challenge for anybody who does it like our extension agents do it, or who do it from a foundation perspective, or but then so is regular electoral politics. And some of the things we've talked about are things that the political system is going to have to do better. And that's even harder in many ways, even more dysfunctional than a community garden. So there's a lot of creativity and effort that needs to happen there.
Okay. Another question, is true synergy the moving of both the left and right positions, or just one of the positions?
Well, I've argued, no, I should point out, in case it wasn't obvious, that my definition of the left and right for the bulk of my talk comes out of 1990. I was talking about traditional business conservatives, right? Traditional business style conservatives, and traditional liberals But once a lot of people got the sustainability religion, I think for the liberals, the notion that everything is a synergy accelerated. I think that traditional conservatives continue to think that most everything is a trade-off, and I have virtually nothing to say about the alt-right. So I still, as of today, the mistaken notion about the world that everything is a synergy, if you were to measure it empirically, that's a left thing. And the mistaken notion about the world that every decision involves a difficult trade-off, that's a habit of the right. I think that's still true. I think that in the real world, both ideas are critically important. And I certainly appreciate there are so many instances, and one of my other studies might be a great example, where if the liberals hadn't begun talking as if there were a lot of synergies lying around, nobody ever would have investigated them. Nobody even would ever have conceptualized them or talked about the specific kinds of public policies that would leverage synergies. And so they are to be praised for that. But yeah, I hold to my left-right distinction. Once you understand, I'm not talking about the alt-right. The traditional conservative and many flavors of liberals tend to have the one a pessimism bias, the other an optimism bias on the 3 sustainability goals.
Thanks, Paul. That's pretty much all the time that we have for the program. As we mentioned, we are going to share Paul's email address in the follow-up email, so you will be able to follow up with questions for him. We do have our next Science Cafe is going to be Tuesday, March 29th, 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. That will be Learning from Chestnut Blight to Control Plant Diseases with Dr. Bradley Hillman. We hope you can join us for that one as well. Mary, do you have anything to say in closing?
No, except for thank you so much, Paul. Fascinating discussion, a lot of valuable points for all of us. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks for Dr. Brad.
I will be there. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you all. Take care.